This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you again for joining us for another Monday evening strategic discussion and overview with myself, Michael Stager. And before I turn it over to Michael, as people know, there we are in a period of our nation where what President Trump is representing for his commitment to make sure that we put an end to these insane wars is being targeted like never before by the British imperial forces, the British Empire, and their commitment to push war to stop President Trump at all costs, and to continue to promote chaos and destruction. And before we get started here, I want to pull up our website, and hopefully people had a chance to watch the video. And I know Michael will kind of take this up a little bit more, but I want to go ahead and draw people's attention to today's update and overview given by Barbara Boyd, which I think is very important, entitled British Backed Chaos, the Color Revolution Masterminds Behind LA's Riots and the War on Trump. And what President Trump committed to and what led to his victory in November 2024 is his commitment to ending these endless wars and his commitment to protecting our borders, stopping the illegal immigration. And he is absolutely doing that. But this is not weighing very well with the forces of Colored Revolution, British Empire, and others, as was discussed in today's update, that are committed to total chaos. And as was discussed in this video update given by Barbara, we can no longer and cannot at all allow for what we're seeing going on in Los Angeles, in California, and any other state in the United States, any other place in the United States where you have such riots. And what's behind these riots goes much deeper than what we might have seen in Waukesha in after the George Floyd. But this is even bigger, to create more chaos and to stop President Trump from the victory of what he is doing to rebuild our economy in the United States. So that's the first thing I want to show you. And then right under that on the website, I want to detail a piece also on this same subject on the role of the British, and entitled "The Brits Turn to Dirty War to Stop Trump's Peace Drive." And this is exactly what the Russians understand as well in terms of who was behind the recent attacks. So why don't we dig into that a bit more, and the role of what your understanding has to be, as we have been discussing, going into the importance of the 2026 elections and those who are going to be running for office, leading in office, have to understand that this is a total transformation that has to happen. And though anyone who's seeking to run for office has to fully back President Trump's policies on economic development, rebuilding the United States economy, and stopping this insane war drive. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Michael and some further discussion going, and then we'll take your questions and discussion following that. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Keisha. So I'm going to assume you've already read Bruce's article on the Brits supporting the Ukrainians and really backing the Ukrainians, and in some sense instigating and provoking the Ukrainians to wage a war on Russia. I mean, the Ukrainians aren't doing this. We should just be clear. Zelensky's government is as legitimate as the Hamas government is in Gaza. Zelensky was elected literally to create peace with Russia. And yet he's been driven to an ongoing escalation of warfare almost entirely by the Brits, and of course then certain British agents in Biden's administration and the U.S. deep state. But let me say, and I'm also going to assume that you've watched Barbara Boyd's video. If you haven't, you should, and you should subscribe to those Promethean updates. You should subscribe to Promethean Action on our website. But we're putting out three shows a week, and Susan Kokinda's video from last Wednesday has over 500,000 views. So we're generating a lot of activity and interest online, and certainly you want to be a part of that. Check out the comments, engage with the comments, and be part of this overall kind of growing impact that our ideas are having. What I want to do tonight is start with something that pulls us back for a second, because part of the problem we face is that too few people, especially the overly educated people. I listened to a kind of eulogy of a Harvard graduate tonight, basically talking about how much of a failure his graduating class has been. They graduated 25 years ago, and he just basically lamented, going back to the reunion, how none of them really understand how much destruction they've waged on the country based on the ideologies that they adopted at Harvard. So somewhat self-reflective and useful. And that's certainly the case. The question is, why do so many people that are well-educated not have a better capability of thinking? And yet people who aren't formally educated can see reality much more clearly. We saw this with COVID. A lot of scales dropped from many people's eyes that began to realize how corrupted and corrosive our medical and propaganda and government systems were, that they would outright lie, create extreme actions based on those lies or false representations, and then mislead the population. But there's a higher level of thinking, or you might even call it, I would consider it a higher level of literacy. And I'll get back to that in the end, I think, in terms of how we approach this problem. But the reason it's important is because much of what's unfolding is not based on any kind of mechanical or percussive interaction of events. It seems very likely to most people that the protests in Los Angeles are happening because of Trump's immigration policy, or the ongoing Ukraine and Russia wars because either Zelensky is petulant, or the British are provoking it because they don't like Russia, or Russia invaded Ukraine, which is the most simplistic, of course, idea. I would put forward, and have on this call many times, as you know, if you've been participating with us, that there's something different happening, which is that a future concept, a future idea that is not yet implemented, that is not yet defined in the world, is what's governing the reactions of why the British are attacking or attempting to provoke a world war with Russia, why certain elements are trying to sabotage Trump's trade agenda, why certain elements are paying. I mean, just get this, the group that's leading the protests in Los Angeles, it's a group called something on immigrant, it's called CHIRLA, and it's a Committee for Higher Immigration Rights in Los Angeles, or something like that. They've literally received something like $34 million from the state government of California as an NGO to provide some kind of public service, I guess. Clearly public services for illegal immigrants. $34 million, and that's what's largely partly funding these protests. So it's both state-backed in many cases, and this is what Trump and Doge and Musk helped clean out with USAID. And then you also have leading billionaires, and Barbara covers this a lot in her video. But this question of this future concept and idea, and the reason why it's so important to understand, and yet why there's so little discussion regarding, one, the domain, and then one, the specific idea that's developing within our culture today. Brian Lance did a very important class on Saturday night regarding the golden standard of science. Part of that golden standard, or that gold standard, is the ability to reproduce experiments. And Brian touched on that because it's been touched on by Vice President Vance. There's been other discussions about it for some time now, because, I mean, a large majority, maybe up to 80% of scientific papers are like one-offs. People do them, and then I don't even know how many are even attempted. I mean, you think of social sciences, my God, the attempt to even want to reproduce it, or why not just make up your own experiment? I mean, why reproduce someone else's when you can do revolutionary new work and publish it in your own name that no one's ever going to try to reproduce, so you can fake the numbers anyways. So, but put that kind of fraud aside, the fraud of pure ambition, which is also what this self-reflection of the Harvard class of 2000 candidate said, we just, how ambition only takes you so far. It's not sufficient to understand how to act effectively in the universe. And there was great regret because he himself had pushed the Iraq War. He now realizes he pushed people that are far less off than he is today as a Harvard graduate and a white-collar worker in Washington, D.C., written books and so on. He put young men to death or maimed, let alone the Iraqis or others that were killed, for a complete lie. And he thought of himself as someone who had done his due diligence. And so it's not as if there's complete moral corruption. There's an inability to think. There is some moral corruption because if there wasn't, then the ability to think would be better. But it's not entirely a moral corruption of people. There's a lack of development of a capacity to think in a higher domain. And the way this is expressed in terms of political discussion is to not see that the future, a conception of the future, of where we're going, is the most powerful determinant of how events are unfolding in the present. To the extent we have lack of clarity, we are going to be externally imposed. Globalists, deep state, the British Empire will effectively impose their future intention on us. They don't have unmitigated power. They have actually very small fractional power to act upon our government, our nation, and the majority of mankind on this planet. But to the extent that there is a lack of a domain of principle, what do I mean by domain of principle? That it's not perceived by the senses entirely. All you can perceive in the sensual world is oftentimes misleading. Plato's dialogues are famous for making this point, that there's a quality of intersection of surprising events, paradoxes, or ironies that occur, which provoke a sense that what I thought it was is not. And so there must be something else occurring there. There must be something else beyond simply what I can perceive acting upon the process. You know, science has unfolded that there are many aspects of the sensual domain that we don't perceive. So we see visible light. We don't see infrared. We don't see ultraviolet. We don't see radio waves or X-rays. But yet we've learned to kind of make those part of our senses with new technologies. So we've expanded our sensory perceptions or sensory apparatus. That works within the physical world. But you have to take then the methods of discovery of those technologies or of the discovery of those domains that were invisible at once and then made visible by new technologies, and look at the discovery process to then take that discovery process and apply it to the course of human civilization, which is not merely an abiotic set of electromagnetic, gravitational, or other waves or interactions. There's a cultural dynamic to it. There's a human mind engaged. Yet there are still paradoxes and contradictions that arise. Oftentimes, when those arise, most of the population, most of the journalists will completely ignore it. If you've ever played chess or anything, a game of that nature, you'll often notice that you can be playing, and yet what you thought you saw as the board, you completely missed something. It's not uncommon that people will completely miss the most obvious. This is something that the American writer Edgar Allan Poe points to, that sometimes the most easiest way to hide something is to put it in plain sight, because people will always think the most important things, the things that people are trying to keep hidden, will be somehow in some secret place. So the point I'm making is that our ability to think about the strategic world requires us accessing this domain of principle. As a famous mathematician, Carl Gauss, said, to pierce that veil beyond the senses, beyond just the numbers, beyond just the equations, to say what's behind these equations that makes them true. What's the domain of principle? Gauss called that concept the complex domain. And it relates then to the development of complex numbers and other factors. But it was a fight within science. It's a fight within science today, because so much of science is just describing what we empirically see. You can lies, statistics, lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can take any set of information perceptually within the sense perceptual realm and then come up with some reason why that's happening. It doesn't justify it if you're just measuring the senses. You have to hypothesize something beyond the senses and then test it. A revolutionary concept. The best example we have in the modern age is, of course, Einstein. That same method is of critical value in evaluating strategic situations like the one we're facing today. Because there is no doubt that what President Trump is engaged in is a complete transformation and the development of a global political, economic, and strategic system, a global system that has never existed before. There is no hallmark for that process. There's no reference to it. It's not something that existed in any previous period. It's only possible today because of the developments of the previous centuries. And specifically in this case, one of the most clear points of reference of how Trump is building this new system is the concept of a nation state. Up until the end of World War II, really the only predominant nation states that existed in the world were in Europe and the Americas. That's it. And the reason they existed in the Americas, contrary to all of the globalist interests going back centuries, was that the United States was effectively able to form a sovereign nation state against European oligarchical interests. And then all the other peoples of the Americas followed suit, formed their own nations. Mexico, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, and so on. They created a nation state and they replicated the principles. They saw the principles governing our Declaration of Independence and replicated that. But for the rest of the world, which is the broad swath of human population on this planet, had no idea what a sovereign nation state was, that individuals participated in shaping their government, never even had a concept of it. So that's just one example of how this historical process, what's possible today, has been shaped and evolved. At least this concept, if these nations, including ours, has lost some sense of sovereignty, the system of nation states today is actually far more possible than it ever has been before. Now, that was a long introduction, but I think it's critical to understand how Trump and this moment is shaped if we don't place ourselves in at least a contemplation of a completely different way of thinking than what we're surrounded by in our daily cultural activities. Because everyone just accepts the more practical version. 80% of the time, maybe even 98% of the time, you might get by with that. But the reality is that 2% or 20% can be where the great, remarkable discoveries and joys and developments and advancements take place, especially if you're facing strategic warfare, right? If it's an existential fight, which this is, the globalists are out to destroy our country. We've taken a step back from the precipice. All we've taken thus far is a step back. And from that step, we're creating as much development, as much rapid economic investment, development, construction, trade deals. We're moving as quickly as possible under Trump's leadership to do all of that. But we're still only one step back from the precipice. To secure it further means cultural kind of engagement in that strategic war that at least reminds us that we have to think like true human beings. We have to think like Prometheus. We have to think with that kind of God-given creative spirit, that creative foresight that is the very hallmark of human civilization, the very nature of the kind of the quality we would reference as the distinct quality of the human soul. Because that's the fight here. The enemy rejects that. They reject the concept of the soul. They reject this quality of thinking. So last week, in this discussion on Monday night, I largely emphasized and highlighted the dangers that had developed and escalated around Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, the launching of hundreds of drones, 150 drones, into Russia at 4 or 5 different major air bases, targeting Russia's long-range bombers. So Tu-160s, Tu-95s, and other launch systems or radar systems. And this was an unprecedented escalation. There had been a previous attack about a year or so ago, a year and a half ago, targeting Russia's radar systems, which was part of their strategic capability. If they lost complete radar vision on what was being launched from the US or Europe, there would be a kind of panic. So that was a similar kind of attack, akin to a strategic threat, not a tactical one on the ground like the invasion in Kherson or something, but a threat to Russia's ability to defend itself from a nuclear attack. Now, we've since known, and this is what we've covered in the videos from last week in Bruce's article, the British had a direct hand. They've been working in Ukraine, setting up stay-behind terrorist operations. There's a leading Brit who's also an American, Fiona Hill, who's advocating for an increased escalation of terrorist activity from Ukraine. The CIA kind of leaky faucet. I just dropped his name. David Ignatius at the Washington Post said that if the United States is no longer going to be backing this, then UK and Ukraine, British and Ukraine, have to be further engaged in terrorist-like activities. This is the plan. We can drag this war out. The Russians are well aware of this. Lavrov today said, we know the British are involved. We know the plan is an extended terrorist campaign. There's even reports the British were working in Latvia to build and develop drones. So much of this could have been deployed directly by British manufacturing and capability, then deployed over the Russian border in the Baltics somewhere versus Ukraine. All with the British thumbprint, and all of it identified by Russia. So since that week, that has developed, and that picture has become more clear. And the Russians have stated unequivocally, including their ambassador to the UK, that Donald Trump has denied this. We do not think the United States government administration was involved. Of course, it could have been certain layers that are not reporting effectively, that are working with the British, but they're directly pointing to the British. And the Downing Street, the Prime Minister's administration in the UK, has not denied it. They say they will not comment on operational deployments. So more or less a concession. That is a major strategic shift that has been brewing for some time. The Russians have been pointing to the British in this way over the last number of years, really since Russiagate erupted to target President Trump. There have been ongoing references to the British, but this kind of consolidation and an explicit reference that it's not the United States, it is only the United Kingdom at this point, that Trump has fundamentally shifted U.S. policy. But even more important than that, which of course is largely overlooked by much of the media in terms of its strategic significance, is the phone call that President Trump had with Vladimir Putin on Wednesday. So we talked last Monday. 2 days later, they had a phone conversation. And there were 2 different reports on that discussion. One was Trump's Truth, where he said he just had an hour-and-a-half long conversation. This is, by the way, the 4th conversation between Trump and Putin. In that discussion, at the end of Trump's Truth, he mentioned that Trump likely was referencing how we're not moving with the speed he would like to in resolving the conflict with Iran, the question of a nuclear weapon and uranium enrichment. Russia also has concerns about Iranian enrichment, and they've taken steps in the past to help try to solve this problem. Putin then apparently volunteered, as Trump reports it in Truth, that Putin volunteered to help engage Iran to create a deal between the Iranians and the Americans. Now, that might seem fine and sweet and good, just an empirical fact, a bromance between Trump and Putin. But what we've been saying now for months is that the core question of a new global system does not intrinsically hinge on tariff and trade negotiations. It will ultimately become a new trading and economic system. But at the heart of this is a fundamental new relationship among nations. And you start with the two nations which are the largest nuclear powers who are on the verge of a major escalated nuclear conflict. Solving that problem and shifting it, of course, we can use the term judoing, the threat of nuclear war into a close collaboration between the US and Russia to immediately then use their combined power and weight to address these problems like Iran's nuclear program, the kind of instability in Israel's government, and other problems, including the India-Pakistan problem, which they also discussed, Trump and Putin. That it's this kind of dynamic and relationship forged by strong, capable leaders, much like what Kennedy and Khrushchev did to avoid the Cuban Missile Crisis. But of course, we were so locked into a Cold War at that time. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It is not an ideological extreme state. It is a state looking for its own physical survival, facing the same problems all other nations are from globalization and the long extended period of warfare and conflict. So Trump makes that clear that I'm working on this kind of relationship with Russia, and the implications of it would be huge. Imagine if a deal with Iran is solved because of US-Russia partnership. What kind of message that sends to the rest of the world, what kind of strength that creates in terms of a peace and stability, and to allow greater economic advancements to occur. So you can't understand those kinds of moments if you're not thinking about where this process could go. You have a creative hypothesis, a constructive hypothesis. What are we trying to build? How can we get there? And do other people also see it? Well, clearly Trump and Putin both do. They know we get out of this current system, this current construct, this post-war British construct, and build something different, or we are going inevitably towards nuclear war. Maybe it'll be after Putin and Trump are both dead, but that's where the world is going. That's where these evil globalists are taking us. Now, following that, Trump had, on Thursday or Friday, had Chancellor Merz of Germany in the Oval Office for one of these press conferences that he does. And he was asked a question about his dialogue with Putin. And at one point, Merz even said, we're backing the Ukrainians, the Russians invaded, the Russians are evil. And Trump was like, that's one way of putting it, basically. But Trump said something that really made it very clear. This was after Zelensky had done this attack, and Putin and Trump had talked. And Trump says that he told Putin on the phone call, maybe this is like two kids fighting in a schoolyard. That sometimes you have to break them up. Sometimes, though, it's better if you just let them fight it out a little bit longer. Like, get the animosity out, get your licks in now, and then you can be brothers afterwards. Fight it, exhaust some of the animosity, the animus. That idea, I'm sure we're all familiar. There's no reason to beat it up. So now what Trump, referenced that. I'm sure a lot of the people, the globalists watching this, were just blew fuses when Trump said that. It was an explicit reference to the fact, one, because Trump had already reported that Putin told him Russia is going to have to retaliate hard for that attack on their strategic bombers. They just can't accept that that takes place. They have to escalate their conflict. And the Americans have apparently said in the administration that the retaliation, the attacks we've seen over the last few days have not been that bigger retaliation, that Russia is planning something larger. That may be true. It may be true that they're just going to escalate along the entire front, creating buffer zones, moving territory. They've consistently said to the Ukrainians, take the deal now because any deal later will only get worse. And that's likely true because Russia, what Trump gave Putin was a recognition, a conceptual recognition that if you have a petulant Zelensky, a Zitler, who has a penchant for World War III because of his controllers in London and elsewhere, that he is hell-bent on fighting this thing out with neo-Nazi-like deployments in Ukraine and gives no regard for the people of Ukraine, is literally rounding them up on the streets, kidnapping them and throwing them in vans, like the Soviet Union, like just jumping on people in the middle of the night and grabbing them out of bed and putting them into the front lines to be ground down. There are reports that Ukraine only has a third of the drones that they need, that some of the drones are then being bought by people on the front lines. Some of the drones are being volunteered by family and supporters back home. There clearly is a total breakdown in the Ukrainian front line. And so Trump has told Zelensky this since he was in the Oval Office. You hold no cards. What are you doing? So if you're going to keep fighting, if you think the Brits and the French are sufficient to back you up, when I'm telling you as the president of the United States, you've got nowhere to go here, pal. You're only going to lose more territory. You keep this up. And don't think you're going to drag me into this. I'm not going to get dragged in your insistence on a 30-day ceasefire. I'm not going to get dragged into any of your ploys and games. I'm not some naive fool. I'm not Obama. I'm not Biden. I'm not Bush. I'm not these kind of lackey presidents we've had for too long. I know what the game is here. I know your type of person. So Trump makes it clear what's unfolding here. Now, to all of us, this may be obvious what Trump was meaning and what he said. And it's obvious what the importance is. For the Russians, that's been their point the entire time. Let us just go ahead and kick the living daylights out of this little petulant creep, and then they'll learn their lesson. Give us a little bit of, let our hands untie a little bit. And if the Ukrainians really think they want to fight this, let us show them what Russia is really capable of doing. Not because they want to destroy Ukraine. They don't. Putin has been very clear. These are fellow Slavs, a brother nation of the same origins of the Kiev Rus people going back thousands of years, and that they're intimately tied with Eastern Orthodoxy, Christianity, and other cultural, long historical ties like World War II and others. So the response that has been reported by one of Putin's advisors, a guy named Kirill Dmitriev, he expressed it in an X post yesterday, is that there was support from the Russian people towards increased collaboration with the United States directly has gone from 50%, which is probably a significant increase from 6 months ago before the election, to now 80%. The Russian people recognize Trump's capability and interest and commitment is what they had hoped. Now, of course, you've got all kinds of cynics, and you certainly have to maintain a healthy kind of skepticism throughout all of this, because there is certainly a dynamic that can shift and change. But Trump knows the game. He has, he's put himself through the wall of fire. He knows that what he's devoted to is establishing something profound, yes, for the American people first and foremost, but that what's required to sustain that is to make sure that we have a secure global system, that the British and globalists cannot, once he's gone, once our regime goes back or becomes in flux once again, after this Trump era ends, that we're not replunged and replunged back into these geopolitical conflicts. The same thing Putin has said, the underlying causes of the war have to change. So these are huge developments. And you see it by the response in the Russian people. They were able to measure it because they were told what happened. They got a sense of what that fourth phone call was, and there was a clear response. The American people increasingly know that we should pull out of Ukraine. There's increasing voices, whether it's Steve Bannon or Alex Jones or others, who are telling Trump, just get out. Don't play games with this any longer. It's this viper pit everywhere. And that's certainly the case. But Trump has a vision that most of these other people don't have. He's building an entirely new system. Now, again, why can't more people see this process? Why can't they imagine it, even if they're fully engaged and even fully on the side of ending the Ukraine war, pulling out of it? Well, let me just give a reference, because in some sense, we need to start discussing some of the deeper aspects of policies and assumptions and approaches that we've taken that are just not working. Before this video started, someone referenced how there's an increasing obsession that the real way to fix education is to start to bring in AI. Now, if you look at the trend, for the last 20 years, they've constantly said, if you only bring in the internet, if you bring in tablets, if you bring in interactive games, it's been a constant set idea that if you bring in technologies, if you bring in apps, if you bring in the newest fad from Silicon Valley's capability, which are always forming companies and always looking for those companies to get big paychecks from governments, local, state, school boards, federal contracts, to say we're going to use this to solve the problem of education. We spend more per pupil than any country in the world. And of course, we're at the lowest of any developed country in terms of educational standards. So there's a lot of money being spent. Somebody's getting that. And now the AI industry wants to get big bucks on it too. But let's take it from a different just concept that has been pushed for some time now. And that's STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I think that's the acronym. But we all heard it. We hear it all the time. STEM. We need more STEM. We need more STEM. People are obsessed. Parents are obsessed. What's the quality of STEM education at their schools? Because the new world is so scientific and engineering and technological and computer oriented that our children need to know how to interface with that world, and they need to know STEM. Well, the question is scientific literacy through knowing how to use technology, how to use a computer, how to interface with it, even to code, which is simply knowing what buttons to push or what instructions to give, or understanding engineering components, or knowing mathematics really well. Do those necessarily imply understanding how the universe works? And that's part of the problem, that you're creating an artificial environment of technology, of computers, of engineering, of various mathematical languages, and say, just get familiar with all of these artificial, these languages and technologies we've developed. Get really familiar with them. What are you not stressing? You're not stressing, become very familiar with how your mind works when it engages with the universe as a whole. Don't just become familiar with how the universe appears to you in your senses, what buttons to push, what instructions to give, how to deploy certain technologies, how to manipulate it effectively to get what you want, which is essentially how they're basically organizing the STEM instruction, the STEM education. Learn how to get what you want by deploying these kinds of things. Adapt to our cultural framework that this is the future all hinges upon this. What they're not asking young people to do is to become very familiar with their own mind. Now, that's oftentimes referenced as a classical education, but then classical education gets reduced to read these set of classical texts. So read these novels, read these political speeches, read these philosophical works, and now you have a classical education. But that's not the case either. That doesn't suffice as a process of ensuring that there's a quality of familiarity with your own mind. You have to make the individual mind the subject. their individual mind, because we all face neuroses. We all face, problems from family. We all face insecurities or challenges in the process. What you're looking for is a broad concept of literacy. Because what is literacy? Literacy is the familiarity with concepts that are somewhat outside the normal practical day-to-day references. Literacy, if you have a broad span of reading, of experiences, of investigations, of dialogue with different people, and you're constantly pursuing them with higher levels of the ability to read in abundance, not just know how to do mathematical equations or how technology works. And that's which is how science itself has been reduced. But real science is the ability to know things from a verbal process that you can come up with, that you can construct language from the vocabulary you have available in your language. You can construct ideas, construct references and concepts to describe something you've never thought of before, that maybe no one has ever thought of before. That isn't going to be a mathematical statistical equation. It's going to be an idea you think of in terms of actual language, in terms of ideas. And you're going to have to find some verbal construct. The very same problem that takes place within that kind of scientific or rigorous philosophical thinking about what's possible, but doesn't seem to have, no one has yet described it for you at least, and maybe never before, is similar to the same process that a poet takes up when they're looking to construct and develop a new poem. The same challenge exists there. You don't start a scientific discovery by coming up with an equation to describe empirical phenomena. You don't take what you see with your senses and then describe it and write it down. There's nothing new there. The concept and idea was, how did you make that phenomena visible? How did it all of a sudden appear when you couldn't see it before? It was somehow on the chessboard, but you didn't see it. It was somehow in the sensual domain, but yet you had no interaction with it, like infrared light. Somebody had the concept or insight that it was there. That quality of thinking, that broad quality of literacy. It's not surprising that Frederick Douglass was such the epitome and example of true human freedom. This is the man who basically fought to the death, or was willing to fight to the death, for his own freedom. But why was he willing to do that? Because he had learned to read, and he couldn't stop reading once he learned, and he became a leading intellectual figure. The question of literacy, of broad investigations, not just of reading the right books, but you just read, you investigate, you provoke. It's not about getting spoon-fed what social media might give you. It's about constantly being provoked to look at how the universe is functioning. It's only by this method that you then have the ability to develop and solve the problems that mankind faces. Now, Trump isn't the biggest reader. I'm not saying you have to be an academic or a bookworm or just, pile up a bunch of books. It's to the extent you facilitate a recognition and awareness of your own mind. Trump has that. He literally is a very stable genius. He knows his own mind, and he knows that what he thinks, what he likes to think, is oftentimes different and opposed to what everybody else seems to think. And he likes that. And he's found in his course of his life that instinct in him is right. It's true, and it's important. It will be the determination whether that building is built or is a complete financial and total collapse and failure. That nothing ever gets built, and it's just kind of a wasteland for some period of time. The ability to follow your insights, to recognize what's true outside what everybody else seems to recognize. He's doing the same thing now on a global strategic level. And it's our role to participate in that. And it's to do that is not just to be aware of it, it's to constantly engage in that quality of thinking, to provoke others into that kind of thinking, and to make sure that on a domestic level, as we build out our energy sector, and Brian covered this on Saturday. If you haven't watched it again, you certainly should. It's a 2-part class series. Keisha joined him on Saturday night. Trump wants to build an additional 400 nuclear power plants in the next 25 years. We have 100 built right now. He wants to build 500 operating plants. or 400. That means each state would be building something like 8 plants per state. And they can take 5 to 10 years to build. We better get cracking. I mean, this is huge. But the other component of that kind of industrial process is a cultural element. And it's not, did you listen to Beethoven or Mozart or Bach? Certainly you should. And we can replicate those qualities of musical compositions. But it's not just doing the right things. It's not following the rules. It's investigating that quality of the mind, which is its natural impulse. The natural tendency of the mind is to constantly seek the future, to constantly challenge the rules. It's how the human mind really works. It's just been dulled out too often and too much by cultural tendencies. We can unleash and provoke this in the American people. Trump's courage, this political shift can unleash it. And if we continue to build and fight for that kind of dynamic, it will be easy to completely dismiss the Democrats in the midterms and in this coming period of the next 10, 15, or 20 years, to relegate them to severe minority, to force a complete reconstruction of the American left in politics. And it will make obvious that the obsessions towards sex and violence that we see so clearly in the LA riots, the drugs, the gangs, the illegal immigration, that these kinds of things are clear and imminent threats to the country's long-term survival. It's not like the media can continue to pull the wools over our eyes. And I think we all know that that's what has to change. That kind of cultural shift, the scales dropped to basically see the world as it really is with COVID in terms of just obvious corruptions. But it's now time to start to see the other part of the world of all the potential that God gave us to unfold. And it's not like you can just tell people about it. You've got to provoke them and engage them into this kind of thinking. That's what Trump is doing on the global stage. Most people see it. We've got to make sure we can continue to foster it. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say tonight. A little bit more abstract and conceptual. Hopefully you were provoked and enjoyed at least parts of it. And I will bring Keisha back in. Maybe you have some thoughts, Keisha, and we can see if other people want to raise their hand and jump into the discussion tonight.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. That was very good. I think much needed as well, because of just what everyone's getting bombarded with, and the lack of just profound conception of what we're building. And I thought the point that you made about where the process could go and what we're building is extremely important. And this is what people need to participate and really understand. It's not just about what we're fighting against and what we're trying to shut down, but what we're trying to create. And in that context, again, I will emphasize the discussion that Brian led, and I had a chance to participate with him on Saturday, was absolutely profound and very good on this gold standard. You think this is what's coming from the Trump administration when you've had decades of just complete insanity from Obama, Biden, Harris, so forth. But Trump is committed to something that is going to expand the mind of mankind, and put an end to just the fraudulency that we've seen in terms of scientific method or lack thereof of scientific method. I do want to say also that in this context of where we're going, what we're building, there's an exciting flight that's going to take place on Wednesday. I think it's scheduled for 8 a.m. Eastern time to the International Space Station, the fourth, Axiom 4 commercial space flight, private space flight that's going to go to the International Space Station. And what's interesting about this is going to fly on a Falcon 9 rocket, SpaceX, and that 3 of the astronauts flying are from Poland, Hungary, and India. And the fourth, which is going to be the commander, Peggy Whitson, is United States. She's one of the leaders of Axiom 4. She used to be very involved in NASA astronaut. But you think about the Polish astronaut that's on this flight. his job beforehand, before he got pulled in to be an astronaut, and he's going to be the second astronaut to fly since the very first one ever flown in Poland in, I think, the 1970s. But he was working on the Hadron Collider of CERN there, which is looking at uh, smashing protons at speed of light to build new. It's a particle accelerator to build new and create new particles and look at research in terms of nuclear science. And these things, they require a certain just level of creativity and understanding of the human mind that goes way beyond what you may be able to do with AI or any of these things in terms of, how the universe works in that way. So I think what you presented just kind of opens people's minds up to something more profound, which is kind of lost in our political arena or at this current moment in time. So I just wanted to add those comments there quickly.
Yeah, appreciate that. I mean, it's true. I mean, that's, we for young people today, they'll have grown up with an iPhone their entire life. They'll have grown up with the internet and YouTube and social media. These things won't be new, but they kind of still grew up when there was rotary phones or something. I mean, I remember it on Sundays when you tried to call family, sometimes you'd try to call and it'd be busy because everybody was calling family on Sundays. And the long distance calls, you couldn't always get through. And it costs a lot of money. So, people got accustomed. I can still hear my grandma say, this is costing you a lot. I mean, we'd be on cell phones. I'd be on my cell phone and she'd be like, this is costing you a lot of money, because they just assumed that those things were true. The question for young people today, what's going to be increasingly provocative, is going to be not all the gadgets. The gadgets aren't going to be new. Things like AI aren't going to be new. They're going to have grown up searching on Google, Gemini, and Grok all their questions. What's going to be increasingly provocative to them is going to be that the human mind has this constant ability to think completely differently. That the answers aren't all in Grok, that these are just kind of electrical processes taking place in a huge amount of computers with a lot of energy and heat consumption. I mean, there's going to be a different kind of quality emerging within young people, where they don't assume that these kinds of technological advancements are somehow the great success story or the great penicillin to solve all problems. Which a lot of the tech people kind of assume. The tech utopians kind of assume that just more technology will just keep solving more problems. But the core question is, what gives great joy to life, what gives great joy to raising children, is to develop and watch their minds grow. Watch how they think and become self-conscious and self-aware of how their mind grows. That's what's exciting. And so I think, if there's the right political leadership like we have now, and the right economic policies to make families and the free time and the physical inputs available, then with the right kind of cultural catalyst, with the right kind of insights and cultural leadership, we can provoke this kind of tendency within the coming generations. I think they're going to be we already see it with Trump. The younger generations responding to just bold, real, analog leadership in the real world.
Yeah, you just have to give young people, children coming up, the opportunity for that creativity to spark with all of the just evil that's going on, whether it's in the school system. I mean, I'm not even talking about AI or anything like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's a whole different subject. But in the advanced technology, I mean, some of that is needed, but just what you're seeing in terms of a attack on creativity, that you have to think to the standards, think as we want you to think. That's
right. Just follow the rules. No.
rules.
And that's why 90% of college students are just using AI to do all their homework, because now all the answers to everything are literally not just in the back of the book, at your fingertips.
Mm-hmm.
And so if all it is, if it's just gross ambition and just give you the answer you want to hear, and that's all I know, that's all I think of school, is give you the answer I want to hear, get my good grades, and then get a lot of money.
Yeah, I have to pass this standardized test, and so if I
Yeah,
can't keep caps and stars and whatever they're all the
right.
different things that you have going on, who's concerned about actually doing something creative, making a discovery when even the teachers are like, oh my God, we just have to get through these standardized tests and pass this state mandated whatever test, and therefore it however you get there, you get there. It doesn't matter, which, is the
Right, which is the complete opposite. And then the economic component of this, which is kind of what the trade skills are. If you look at a book that's often referenced, Freedom Forge, which is a book about how great titans of industry helped build up the industrial capacity to win World War II, the arsenal of democracy. And, Bill Knudsen, Henry Kaiser, these guys had almost no high school education. They were immigrants. They worked with their hands. They were involved in construction and production. What there was an ability, a certain kind of redemption, that if you didn't just do everything statistically right, you applied yourself hard in high school, you followed all the teacher's orders and rules, you did everything you were supposed to do, you went to the college, you replicated that same process, and you end up like one of these regretful Harvard graduates who basically spent some part of the last 25 years nearly destroying the entire civilization that they're a part of. These guys were able to come in as adults. And that's the point. Sometimes it's people who are plunged into great difficulties and challenges who don't have the easy pathway or the clear formulaic pathway. It's not necessarily easy, but it's formulaic. You know exactly what you need to do when you need to do it. So it's just checking the boxes. May not always be easy, but it's clear what needs to be done. But it's the people that go through life without that clear pathway that sometimes have to interact with the real universe. And it may not be in that kind of challenge. Once it's overcome, then they end up bringing a completely different quality of leadership, insights, productive skills that from the process they really were challenged and learned by. But a society that says, oh, you're 25, you barely graduated high school, you never went to college, you're worthless. If that's the message that's sent, then or go to college and just do what everyone says, and you're like, well, these people don't know what they're teaching. This is bogus. What am I doing? There's no quality of redemption, but you're also not rewarding that kind of creative impulse that doesn't just come through formal education. It comes through life experiences. You take someone like William McKinley or Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was a retired soldier, but because he was able to be effective in the war, he rose to the level of general of the army. In real existential fights where survival is required, you look to the people that have that kind of moral leadership, that kind of insight, that kind of determination, and you elevate them. You scrap all the other so-called rules. Lincoln had all kinds of generals that went to West Point and were exactly what everybody in Washington said were the greatest generals. They consistently failed. You create that kind of shift in culture. And, then broad literacy. I mean, Frederick Douglass didn't read in Greek. He didn't read in Latin. It wasn't like he had it wasn't like he read every book ever, but there was an engagement with the mind that became an historical force. And that's what we're talking about, unleashing that kind of historical force in the minds of the American people. That's what Trump is calling for. That's what Trump has provoked from that kind of forgotten men and women. Not just that they're important and valuable, but that the way they think, their thoughts, their sense of direction is actually far better than a lot of the so-called experts.
Good. Okay.